Night after night, from the first day of the Second World War until almost the last, a deadly ritual took place at RAF airfields up and down the country. Thousands of airmen squeezed into briefing rooms and hangars to receive their targets for tonight's bombing raids. Their mission? To smash German industry and break the will of her people to fight.
You were all agog to see that curtain pulled back and see where you were going. If it was a dangerous target, you could actually feel the tension.
That was the most awful moment, was when they revealed where the target was. It was either, oh, good-o, or God almighty, not again.
In 6 years of war, the RAF would launch more than 250,000 raids against Nazi Germany. On board, tens of thousands of Britain's most highly trained fighting men. Ahead of them, a terrifying trial of nerve and endurance.
Every operation you ever did, you always looked back at the coast and thought, am I saying goodbye? Will I see it again?
Over Germany, I used to tremble. The roar of the engines, and outside, just darkness, darkness, darkness. And when you were over Germany, of course, death seemed to be waiting you everywhere.
And it was. The skies over Germany were bristling with the war's most fearsome defensive systems. Radar, flak towers, night fighters, and blinding batteries of searchlights.
You felt that the whole world was looking at you, and also every anti-aircraft gun was firing at you personally.
All of us knew within a matter of seconds German fighters above us were going to start diving down, realising that we were all virtually blinded by this terrible white light.
Just above us was another Lancaster. He was coned, not just by one searchlight, by probably a dozen. Even if he weaved or dived, he was in the lit area. We actually saw a fighter just cruise up behind him, open fire. That was the end of it. Gone.
By the end of the war, more than 8,000 heavy bombers would be blown out of the sky.
All around me was an inferno. Then I heard the screams. Screams of people being burnt alive. As I was falling in my descent in the parachute, I realised that I would never see my friends again.
For the aircrews of Bomber Command, the chance of surviving a tour of 30 operations was just 1 in 4. More than 55,000 men lost their lives in the skies over Germany. Many more were injured or mentally broken by their ordeal.
You were putting into these bombers to fly them your fittest, your cleverest, your most technologically skilled young men. These were probably the most highly trained frontline fighters in the history of war. And the odds were considerable. You were going to lose him in his first 2 or 3 trips.
During the Second World War, more than 125,000 men laid their lives on the line in the service of Bomber Command's desperate campaign. Men like Stephen Nolan, Harry Smith, Fred Logan, Ivor Chambers, and Nicholas Alcomade. In September 1940, thousands of tons of high explosives began to rain down upon London and the rest of Britain's major cities. Over the next few months, more than 43,000 civilians would be killed.
We will mete out to the Germans the measure, and more than the measure, they have meted out to us.
Churchill now ordered the RAF to throw everything into an all-out bomber offensive against Germany. But there was a problem. The Air Force had neither the men nor the aircraft to launch an effective bombing campaign.
One of the mainstays of Bomber Command in 1940 was the Fairey Battle, a single-engined aircraft, which had actually been designed in 1933. It was underpowered then. It was seen at the time that the battle was better than nothing. In fact, it was probably a great deal worse than nothing. it was a flying coffin.
In May 1940, the RAF's flying coffins were blasted out of the sky in a futile attempt to hold back the German advance through Western Europe. Even the most up-to-date British aircraft, the Wellington, Whiteley, Blenheim and Hampden, were no match for the faster, heavily armed German fighters. Something had to be done.
Equipment had always been a problem for Bomber Command. All Bomber Command's aircraft were twin-engined with a limited range and a very limited bomb load. So everyone was waiting for a machine that really would be reliable, that could fly high, that could defend itself and could drop a really heavy bomb load.
The RAF's first four-engined heavy bombers, the Stirling and the Halifax, entered service in 1941. But they were unreliable and suffered high casualties as they were unable to climb above the German anti-aircraft guns. The Avro factory thought they had the answer with the twin-engined aircraft, the Manchester.
It was not very popular, it was not very effective, it suffered from unreliability. But somebody had the brilliant idea of turning this twin into a four-engined heavy, and so was born the Lancaster.
It was what the RAF had so desperately needed. A powerful, long-range aircraft that could carry a heavy bomb load deep into the heart of Germany. It could fly faster, further, and higher than any other four-engined heavy. And it was to become the most famous bomber of the Second World War.
Side by side with the pilot, the air gunner learned the deadly trades. The machine gun is the warbird's friend.
Of all positions on a bomber crew, the air gunner was the most vulnerable and the least envied. Locked in cramped turrets for up to 10 hours, often in sub-zero temperatures, gunners needed to cultivate enormous reserves of stamina and concentration.
They said, you can be a navigator, you can be a bomb aimer. I said, no, I don't want to fight my war with pencils and rulers. I said, I want to fight them. I said, put me in a tail turret and give me 4 guns and I'll fight it that way.
We're what one would call ordinary. Pilots are not ordinary. They're the supermen. We're not. We're not. We're ordinary Tom, Dick and Harry.
As they say, big thumbs, no brain. All they needed was a big thumb to press the trigger.
We were the oil rag of the crew, as it were. We were the least educated, but I think we were the most courageous.
By the summer of 1941, the first of the British four-engined heavies had arrived, and with them, thousands of new bomber crews, bracing themselves for their first brush with Nazi airspace.
You'd walk into the mess for breakfast each morning, and you'd have a look at the notice board, and there was always a thing called a battle order. And the idea was to look down, and if you saw your name on the battle order, then that was the advice that you're on up that particular night, and you get a certain amount of tension.
There was always at the back of your mind, really, was that fear and wondering, were you going to come back for your bacon and eggs? For your breakfast? Were you?
By the middle of 1941, the RAF was launching 4,000 bombing sorties a month against Nazi Germany. Their mission? To find and destroy German arms factories and oil production.
It was generally accepted that the most risky raid was the first raid, because although they taught you well in the schools, you were then going to learn what life was really all about.
We were a bit jittery always when you took off, mainly because you always had that fear of an engine cutting, and swinging off the runway with a full bomb load was not to be recommended at any time.
First trip scared the hell out of you, really. People were shooting at you from all directions. And you thought, hey, God, you know, I'm not going to survive this lot for very many trips like this.
By 1941, the air crews were paying a heavy price for their courage. In June alone, more than 1,200 men were blown out of the sky.
You'd go to bed at night, and there were 2 crews to a Nissen hut, and one would fly maybe, and the next morning they wouldn't come back. And
I was very impressed with the impact of 4 guns, which each fires 600 rounds a minute. So there's 40 rounds per second going out of your 4 guns. And if you can hit an aircraft with that, it certainly blows holes in it. I found that very satisfactory.
When I saw the bullets, my bullets, hitting home on the enemy aircraft, I felt power. I've hit back. Perhaps the only one I will hit back to, but I've hit back at one.
The role was introduced in 1942, at a crucial stage of the war. The British Army was retreating in the Far East and North Africa. Singapore had fallen, and U-boats were inflicting huge losses in the Atlantic. Only bombers could hit back at Germany.
The total impact of Bomber Command upon the German public up to the spring of 1942 was essentially nil. It was costing more lives of Bomber Command aircrew than those Bomber Command aircrew were killing Germans.
A radical overhaul was needed. In just 6 months, one man would turn Bomber Command around. Arthur Harris.
When Arthur Harris took over Bomber Command in early 1942, he was really taking over a failing organisation.
Harris, by sheer force of personality, gave a force and direction to the bomber offensive which had been completely lacking.
Because he was very clear about what he was doing, he was able to give people the feeling that it was all worthwhile. When someone comes over the air and says, you're going to go to Berlin and you're going to hit the enemy and burn his black heart out, then, as one crew member said, they'd have walked to Berlin to drop their bombs.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
It would be a whirlwind that relied entirely on the calibre of the men who formed Harris's bomber crews. Pilots capable of flying their lumbering giants across Europe and back through the best organised defences in the world. Navigators capable of guiding those aircraft to their target through pitch-black skies. And bomb aimers with the precision and nerves of steel to ensure maximum accuracy. Trying to bomb small targets was simply not possible. Tactics would have to change radically.
Bomber Command simply didn't have the means to attack a single factory or a single marshalling yard, so they would choose industrial areas where there was a complex of targets.
If the smallest object an average crew was capable of finding on a given night was a city, then henceforward Bomber Command would attack whole cities. And the general view that if you hit a given city with sufficient strength, sufficiently often, that the population of that city was unlikely to continue producing armaments for Germany.
It was the Germans themselves who had taught Harris how destructive bombing could be.
He realised that what crippled Coventry was not taking out a few factories that made machine tools, but the burning of the city itself and making the place uninhabitable and destroying its infrastructure. He decided to do that again.
Harris now chose a German city that would let him prove the destructive power of British bombers. Like Portsmouth, his target would be a medium-sized city on the coast. The target was Lübeck on the Baltic.
Bomber Command's raid on Lübeck was one of Harris's first big, important successes, and it reflected his skill in judging what his forces were and were not at that time capable of. That it was far easier to find cities on the coast than cities inland.
It was a city he knew his bombers could find, and whose wooden, densely packed centre they could easily destroy.
In his own rather brutal phrase in his autobiography, he said, Lübeck was a city built more like a firelighter than a human habitation.
It was chosen not because it should be destroyed, but because it could be destroyed. On March the 28th, 1942, 234 bombers set off. Harris's calculations were right. Not only did they find the city, they managed to drop their payloads right on target. 160 tons of high explosives smashed down buildings and blew open walls. Then 144 tons of incendiaries spread the fire. Lübeck was soon a blazing inferno, with over a third of its buildings incinerated. The fire could be seen from 100 miles away. Harris was characteristically frank. "I wanted my crews to be well-blooded," he said. He and Bomber Command had made their mark. Now he would unleash total war on Germany. Armed with a new bomber that will become one of the most famous ever built, the Overy Lancaster. The RAF bomber crews were some of the most highly trained fighting forces in World War II. But it was only in 1942 that they were given the heavy bomber that could turn the tide of the war. The Overy Lancaster.
In order to understand how thrilled the crews of Bomber Command were when they began to receive the Lancaster, one has to remember what had gone before. That since September 1939, they had been asked to fly over Germany in some of the most inadequate aircraft that designers could create, and a great many of them had died doing so. At last they looked at the Lancaster and they thought, this is the aircraft we need.
The Lancaster could fly faster, further and higher than any other bomber. It would become a legend of the RAF.
We were in the lorry waiting to be sent to a Sterling squadron. The lorry was stopped. We were third in the line. The third lorry was stopped. The police came out and they said, take this crew to Waterbeach. I thought, Waterbeach? And then someone said, they've got Lancasters at Waterbeach. We almost cheered, you know. It was Christmas. I had a fantastic feeling. We really felt the whole war had changed already.
The Lancaster is not in the past. It's still present. Means a lot to me. I spent a lot of waking hours in a Lancaster. I feel secure and safe. I can say nothing else. I am safe in that aeroplane.
When I first saw it, I drooled because it was the machine. 4 engines, and it was terrific in handling and all the weight it could carry and the guns it had and the crews you could go with it.
When I went to an operational squadron and went aboard a Lancaster that was in fighting trim, I realised what a wonderful aeroplane the Lancaster was. It's impossible to overemphasise the importance of Lancaster bombers.
Pilots were saying, if it looks right, it is right. And anybody even today has only got to look at the Lancaster and see here is an aeroplane that looks right. It looks like one of the great aircraft, and by God it was.
The RAF had perfected a heavy bomber capable of carrying almost double the bomb load of the American B-17 Flying Fortress. By the end of the war, the Lancaster would drop almost 2/3 of all bombs dropped on Germany. Today, there are only 2 Lancasters still flying in the world.
This British bomber landed in France, so the pilot thought, but what a surprise. When he asked a peasant if he was in France, he got the answer in German. No, this is Germany. The frontier is 20 miles to the west. As one man, pilot and crew dashed to the plane and took off again, to arrive safely in France a little later. At least one war story with a smile in it.
In May 1942, Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command, planned one of his most audacious raids. It would involve nothing less than the greatest concentration of air power in history.
He needed a big, spectacular success. And he came up with this idea of sending 1,000 aircraft, a number nobody had ever thought of, to attack a single German city in a single night.
Press home your attack. If you individually succeed, you will have delivered the most devastating blow against the very vitals of the enemy. Let him have it right on the chin.
That was how Air Marshal Harris, Commander-in-Chief Bomber Command, gave his instructions for the largest air raid the world has ever known.
There was absolutely no magic about the idea of sending 1,000 bombers to attack Cologne rather than 900 or 800, except in propaganda terms.
The figure of 1,000 bombers caught the public imagination. The problem was, Harris's frontline force consisted of only 600 aircraft.
How they scraped that force together, of course, is a story in itself. And about a third of the aircraft that took to the air in May 1942 were actually from training units.
There were some pretty amateur pilots flying to Cologne that night.
While armourers and fitters were at work on the machines, the air crews were receiving final instructions from station commanders.
When it was time to go to the briefing, then you felt tension.
This is the night, and the plan is on.
Outside, the huge bombers were being loaded with the largest cargo of high explosive and incendiary bombs ever to be carried by one striking force to a single objective.
By 1942, just as the bomber offensive was getting serious, so too were the German defences. More and more, as Bomber Command's aircraft became more reliable and they had more confidence in what they themselves were doing, so they had grounds to be more and more fearful of what they found at the other end.
Germany had turned itself into a fortress against attacking bombers. Anti-aircraft defences ringed all their major strategic centres. RAF crews knew only too well what awaited them. They had been forced to mount their operations at night, but not even darkness could offer them protection from the German defences. Early warning radar picked up their course, and walls of searchlights swept the darkness above German cities. After that, the bombers had to run the gauntlet of night fighters and barrages of anti-aircraft fire.
And I speak for myself, I always had a squeezy tummy after briefing. Squeezy tummy going down in the 3-ton lorry to get to the aircraft on dispersal. And then the feeling of fear gripped you. You really didn't know whether you were going to come back that night or not.
On the 30th of May 1942, 1,046 bombers prepared to take off for Cologne. Harris had committed to battle all his frontline troops, his reserves, and even his training units. This was an unprecedented move, staking his entire force on one attack. Codenamed Operation Millennium, the raid would be in 3 waves. 602 Wellingtons led the way, followed by the heavy bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Stirlings.
Obviously, we were a bit jittery. We had butterflies in our stomach, always, when you took off. And I must admit that going down and then crossing the English coast, looking back at the coast, one thought, God, is this going to be the last time I see that? You knew you had to face flak and night fighters, so that was always a worry.
As soon as the crews crossed the North Sea and approached Nazi Europe, the German defences would be on the lookout.
As you got within sight of the Ruhr, you saw these massive amounts of searchlights who were just waving idly in the sky.
There seemed to me to be hundreds of searchlights on the ground. They were just flicking across the sky, just waiting, knowing that there were hundreds of aircraft.
But sooner or later, they would find what they were looking for.
Crews were particularly wary of the radar-guided searchlights.
You had to have half a dozen master searchlights, which were blue beams, and they would stand up absolutely vertically and then would suddenly swing and pick you up. And then immediately you were picked up with that, the other searchlights, 10, 12 or 15 or whatever, would swing round and cone you. You were then coned in searchlights.
To be coned in a searchlight, you thought they were lethal weapons. You felt the whole of Germany was looking at you.
Or the coning was like being in a car with all the headlights shining through the windows at you, and you couldn't see the instruments. Everything brightly lit.
The band of light was quite terrifying because you felt as though you were in a crowd of people in the middle of Piccadilly Circus and you were the only person there who was completely naked.
And of course, once you were coned in searchlights, then the flak opened up.
And all you could do really was to hold on tight and let the skipper do what he could to get you out of it.
Every available German gun would then be trained on the one aircraft.
We were coned by this white light that they had, and we were in it for 12.5 minutes. And the normal survival for being trapped in a cone was 3 minutes. We did every manoeuvre you can think possible, but we got out of the cone eventually. And the pilot said, "I've had enough of this," and he jettisoned the top hatch and decided he was going to parachute out. And I grabbed his legs, and the bomb aimer came back and he helped me. We threw him down the stairs, and then I flew the aeroplane. And halfway back over the North Sea, he sort of got his wits back together and came and took over and took it back in. But we don't talk about it, really.
At its peak, the bomber crews faced over 1 million men and 55,000 flak guns.
The Germans were so efficient they could actually put a barrage of sustained fire up at any one particular height, which was usually between 22,000 and 25,000 feet, and they could actually fill that air and sustain it with flying shrapnel and steel for probably 20 minutes.
They were awesome sights at times, you know, when you see the amount of flak coming up and you've got to fly through it.
You could virtually walk on it, wall to wall.
But when you got amongst it, you could hear the ping as bits of shrapnel hit the aircraft, you know.
I got several bits of flak through the navigator's position, and of course you never knew when one of those bits, lumps of metal, was going to hit an absolutely disastrous part of the aeroplane.
Well, it feels like your aircraft are being buffeted about. You can even get the smell of cordite as well off flak at that height.
And you could get the flashes, and you had the thump of near misses coming all the time.
And then we say, very casually, as Englishmen do, flak was a bit hard tonight, wasn't it?
Penetrating these defences was one thing. Accurately identifying the target was quite another. In August 1942, a new elite corps was set up, the Pathfinders.
Even within Bomber Command, Pathfinders were highly respected. They were regarded as an elite. You were a Pathfinder, and you were one of the guys to volunteer for an especially dangerous role within Bomber Command.
Their task was to drop brightly coloured flares, marking the target for the main force of bombers that followed behind.
Every stage from 1942 onwards, Pathfinders were frightfully important. And of course this had the effect, if the Pathfinders marked the wrong place, then the whole attack went awry.
Leonard, one of the outstanding bomber pilots of the war, would later pioneer a new type of marking, swooping down from the usual bombing height of 20,000 feet to just 500 feet. This film shows one of Cheshire's low-level operations, which was far more dangerous, but also exceptionally accurate.
At that level we could see everything. With all that amount of illumination and light, you could see particular individuals walking about or shooting at you.
Up to 40 minutes before the arrival of the wave of heavy bombers, the Pathfinders would be circling the target area.
You got half a dozen aircraft milling around at, say, 500, 600 feet, hunting for the point to be marked. And there was great competition. Everybody wanted to be the first person to identify the aiming point and mark it. And the first person to spot it shouted out, "Tally-ho!" and then dive-bombed the marking point with his target indicator. It was exhilarating beyond belief because, I mean, there's hails of tracer fire coming up, streams of it, and tracer fire comes up very slowly. You think to yourself, it's only moving very, very slow. But when it got near you, it zapped past at speed. And to fly through that, and also to be competing with your mates for the privilege of being the first marker, it was incredibly exciting. As I say, it was like a 10-minute white knuckle ride.
1,000 bombers ploughed on towards Cologne, the third largest city in Germany. Having already endured heavy anti-aircraft flak and night fighter attacks, they approached their target. They had already battled through the first line of German defences.
You then had to find the target, which was not always easy, particularly as the aircraft might be thrown all over the place at the time.
The target is not just one little tiny thing, it may be an area about half a mile square.
One then went on with the bomb run.
I would then move down into the front of the plane. I would lay on my belly and I would get the bomb sight ready, and then the navigator would say, 4 minutes and we shall be over the target.
Once you got over the target, it got even worse. The flak was intense, searchlight and fighter activity was intense. In fact, as you ran up to the target at times, you wondered whether you'd ever get there for all this get back. Because it was hairy.
In order to bomb accurately, you had to fly straight and level for 4 to 5 minutes.
It seems an eternity, and you are vulnerable. Once those bomb doors are open, anything coming on you, you can't do much about it.
Time just seemed to absolutely stand still. It wasn't making any progress. It took you so long to get there.
And there was a pilot shouting at the bomber, get rid of the things.
There was a tendency, I suppose, to get rid of the bomb and to get the hell out of it as quickly as you could. But it wasn't always easy, as you can probably appreciate.
You got there eventually.
And I would begin to position the pilot up. Left, 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 left. Steady, steady. Bomb's gone.
Every 6 seconds, a bomber dropped its payload into the heart of the city. Harris's gamble had paid off. In less than 2 hours, 600 acres of Cologne was destroyed.
If the target had been plastered properly, it would be all lit up. It was like flying into a Holocaust, really.
At times, you could be fascinated by the sight below, particularly if the target was burning.
It was an awesome sight, and almost indescribable.
1,000 bombers. I mean, the noise must have been awful just from the engines, apart from the bombs.
As you had the fires on the ground, the searchlights, the flak coming up, the fighter flares over the top. They were all vivid colours. Explosions on the ground, explosions in the air. You see aircraft going down. You see an aircraft blow up. You see tracer bullets flying all over the sky.
The thump of the bombs, showers of sparks. It was the greatest pyrotechnic show I think I've ever seen in my life. Here's a target alight. The rivers of gold, rivers of red.
It was purely Dante's Inferno. Everything was fire, flame. Strangely enough, I didn't even think of Cologne Cathedral when I was over there. But I thought of these people, and I didn't know what to do, what to say, and I felt I wanted to say the Lord's Prayer. And it just would not come out. I knew the words, but the words would not come out.
2,500 fires gutted the city. Remarkably, only 469 people were killed, though 45,000 were left homeless. Cologne's war industry was crippled for nearly 2 months. More destruction had been wrought in one raid than in the previous 70 raids put together. Arthur Harris had made his point in devastating fashion. Despite losing 41 bomber crews, there would be no turning back. Bomber Command now had its tactics. The next 3 years of war would be the grimmest yet. By 1943, the destructive power of the Lancaster had been demonstrated in terrifying fashion by the RAF. They'd sent 1,000 aircraft against Cologne in a single raid and reduced the city of Hamburg to a smouldering ruin. Now they wanted to go one better.
There was one target that frightened bomber crews more than any other. Berlin, the big city.
Berlin wasn't just a prized industrial target, it was the political heart of the Third Reich. The head of RAF Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, believed if he could wipe Berlin off the map, Hitler's regime would crumble. But its destruction would come at a price.
Berlin was a long, long way from England. It was at the furthest limits of their range, as far across Europe as you would get. They knew that they would have to fight all the way to get there and all the way to get back. But even some pretty rugged bomber crews' spirits sank pretty low when they knew they were going to Berlin.
For the young airmen of Bomber Command, the prospect of a 10-hour trip into the very heart of the Third Reich held a dread all of its own.
I think everyone went, oh, you know, it was the big city again.
When you saw what you were being asked to do, you said to yourself, am I going to live?
If it was a long target, a big target like Berlin, this feeling in your stomach was there. It was right in the gut, you know.
We were told, you must absolutely wipe it off the face of the earth, because if you don't, you will have to go back tomorrow. And they'll be waiting for you tomorrow, and more of you will get shot down. And I remember thinking, what a dreadful thing to say. He's virtually saying, if we don't do it tonight, we're going to be killed when we go tomorrow night. But that actually was very true.
The bomber crews knew that the route to the Nazi capital was studded with thousands of heavy anti-aircraft guns, filling the sky with flying chunks of red-hot metal. Belts of dazzling searchlights ringed the city, and lurking in the darkness, an even greater danger, the German fighter.
So the bomber crew are flying a slower aircraft that can be caught both from the ground by flak and by fighters in the sky. The bomber is a victim. Potential victim all the time. They just had to sit there and take it.
On the 18th of November 1943, 840 Lancasters, Halifaxes and Mosquitoes began lumbering into the sky. Their destination, the German capital. The battle for Berlin had begun. Slow as they were, the bombers did have one way of hitting back. The gunner. By December 1943, the battle for Berlin was in full cry. But the head of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, couldn't have picked a worse time to attack. The winter of '43 was to be one of the severest on record.
The group captain at North Creek went into the briefing, atrocious weather, just absolutely atrocious weather. And he said, well, gentlemen, Bomber Command has been stood down due to the weather, but as you know, we fly when the sparrows are walking. So they flew.
On their long journey to Berlin during the winter of 1943, for the crews who survived the hazards of bad weather and engine failure, A much greater peril now lay ahead. The German night fighter. Armed with powerful cannons and guided to their targets in the dark by radar, the night fighters were coordinated with flak guns and blinding batteries of searchlights. Together, they formed a deadly barrier across the entire length of northern Europe. It was known as the Kamm-Huber line. Even under the cover of darkness, the bombers were now easy meat.
Essentially, once you'd been found by a night fighter, there was very little chance of survival. There was a night fighter there like a spider in its web, waiting to catch a fly.
Wo der Bodenkontroller uns ranführte,
The ground commander brought us as close as possible to the British. They could see them from as far as 3 kilometers.
Und der Funker sagte dann links, links, rechts, rechts, rechts.
They told you left, left, right, 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 800 meters, 500 meters, 200 meters, and depending on the weather, we could spot them. A good tactic was to fly under them so the plane overhead was like a silhouette.
Himmel als Silhouette zu erkennen.
Once beneath their prey, German pilots unleashed their most deadly weapon, an upward-firing machine gun that ripped open the exposed underbelly of the bomber from nose to tail. On the 10-hour journey into the heart of the Third Reich, only the vigilance of the gunners could give bomber crews even the faintest hope of survival.
His job was to stare out, just stare out, looking for any signs of a night fighter, and to do that minute after minute, hour after hour, for possibly 10 hours.
So many of these missions over Germany resemble driving for hour upon hour on a darkened motorway in which absolutely nothing happens, and suddenly out of nowhere there's this colossal explosion and a night fighter's underneath you and shooting you up. It is so difficult for very young men to maintain that degree of concentration and vigilance.
When they appeared, get off your rounds as quickly as you could.
People were opening fire on what they thought was an enemy aircraft, and it would be marks on the perspex. That's what they were firing at.
If you've got to start thinking, what do I do next? It's too late. You know, it's either shoot or be shot. And you've got to shoot first.
When I knew there was a night fighter on our tail, ready to close in, with his cannon and his machine gun fire, I was terrified.
If the German pilots were really switched on, all they had to do was to cruise up within 1,000 yards and open fire. And there was absolutely no chance that the bombers could reach him.
You can't imagine the damage that's done by concentrated cannon fire, pouring down the fuselage of a bomber. It goes up like a fireball.
To escape the fighters, bomber pilots learned to plunge their aircraft into a steep spiral dive at the very limits of their control. They called it the corkscrew.
Rear gunner would shout, "Corkscrew, port, go!" And the pilot would then plunge the aircraft violently 30 degrees to the left and then violently climb the aircraft to the right. The night fighter, if he finds that the target is so difficult to hit, he's like to say, "Oh, to hell with this, I'll go elsewhere and find easier meat."
I saw one bomber who was caught in the searchlight. He was easy prey. But he escaped the beam by using this maneuver by flying up, and he looped the loop in the aircraft. I couldn't believe my eyes. Whether he survived or not, I don't know.
By January 1944, bomber crews were being shot down in greater numbers than at any time during the war. But for the crews who survived flak and fighter attacks over Berlin, the ordeal was not over.
There was always the dread of the North Sea. I think we all had that dread because If you had engine problems, it'd come down in winter, you were lucky to survive.
Flying bombers over Germany was above all a team effort. You flew with your crew, you drank with your crew, you went on leave with your crew. This unit, you all knew that you depended absolutely on each other. That if the rear gunner fell asleep in his turret, if the mid-upper gunner failed to notice Junkers 88 closing in from the port beam, you were dead.
Even for the exhausted crews who made it back over the British coast, to relax could be fatal. Rogue German fighters waited above RAF airfields to strike as the bombers came into land.
We came into the circuit one night. I think there was 7 aircraft in the circuit. And this Ju-88 came from somewhere and he shot 4 down in the circuit. Boom, 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 boom. All the crews were lost in those 4 aeroplanes. That was 32 men.
It has an extremely unnerving effect on the bomber crews. You can just imagine you've found home, you're just landing for base, and one of them's there waiting to get you.
For the young men at Bomber Command, the terrors of the raid were to be endured again and again. Crews were required to fly a tour of 30 nerve-shattering operations.
One crew turned up at an RAF station and, being young and just fresh from flying training in Canada, asked how long it took to complete the 30 tours necessary, and found rather evasive answers. They discovered the reason for the evasion was that nobody, until then, had succeeded in completing 30 tours.
By early 1944, less than 1 man in 5 was completing their tour of operations. The average crew could expect to survive for just 6 missions.
I have sat some nights in my flight office and watched young aircrew go off, knowing full well that I'd be lucky if I saw 50% of them back again. But they went. That was their job. They were asked to go, and they went.
The battle for Berlin had brought the men of Bomber Command to their lowest ebb. For the first time, morale was starting to crumble. Men were losing their minds.
I just lost my marbles completely. I don't know what I did, what I said, or anything at all. I think a screw went somewhere. That's how I feel myself. They sent me into an RAF mental hospital at Matlock in Derbyshire. I was never the same after that. Never the same.
During the Battle of Berlin, cases of nervous breakdown amongst bomber crews more than doubled. By the end of the war, 6,500 men had been driven over the brink and withdrawn as mentally unfit for service. By March 1944, 5 months of RAF raids against the German capital had failed to deliver the knockout blow their commander, Arthur Harris, had so confidently predicted. Now Bomber Command prepared to launch one final attack. 800 aircraft would fly in 3 great waves, dropping 17,000 tons of high explosive across the city. But the raid was to be plagued by bad weather and ill luck. It would go down in RAF history as the night of the high winds.
One thing Harris certainly was ruthless. He said quite openly at the opening of the Battle of Berlin that it would cost him 400 or 500 bombers. But he said it will cost Germany the war. He was wrong on both counts.
This was to be a huge raid, requiring men and aircraft from every squadron of Bomber Command. 10 p.m, the last of the bombers had crossed the Dutch coast, and a stream of aircraft 200 miles long was pouring across northern Europe. But already, the crew sensed that something wasn't right.
Normally, as you got to the coast, the anti-aircraft fire would have a crack at you. On this occasion, nothing. Not a light, not a sound, nothing. Crew were getting twitchy. It was unnatural, it wasn't right, there was a feeling that it wasn't right.
The crews didn't yet know it, but the RAF's wind forecasts were horribly wrong. High winds were sweeping the bomber stream off course, directly into the firing line of the heaviest anti-aircraft guns in the Third Reich, the Ruhr Valley.
You just cannot believe what happened. The whole sky lit up. Air was absolutely covered in tracer, and aircraft started to go down so fast. Could not believe what you were seeing. You're sitting in a situation where all hell was breaking loose and that the world seems to have gone completely and utterly mad.
Even before they'd reached Berlin, anti-aircraft fire had claimed 25 bombers. And worse was to come. The Luftwaffe had intercepted RAF signals. They knew exactly where the bombers were heading, and they'd sent hundreds of night fighters to ambush them. As the bombers lined up for their slow approach runs over the city, the night fighters swooped in for the kill.
For 20 minutes I was seeing black shadows, and I was more scared of dying that night, I think, than any other time in my life.
Und da ich im Bomberstrom war, sah ich innerhalb der 10 Minuten...
When I got into the bomber stream, I saw 2 or 3, and I shot them down. Then I shot another down. There were fighters who shot down 5 or more.
Wie ich schon sagte, die 5 und mehr.
I suddenly heard these thuds, cannon shells, going through the aircraft.
And there's a little fire coming up here and another fire there, and there are little fires appearing.
He opened up his cannon machine. I really then thought that I was about to die.
It was an automatic reaction. He just squeezed the triggers, and he was belching great black clouds of smoke.
You could see fighters and precious little else apart from aircraft going down.
It's really one of complete mayhem, really.
The attack had gone badly wrong. 72 RAF bombers were shot down on the night of the 24th of March. It was one of the RAF's worst nights of the war, and the last time Bomber Command would send a major raid against the German capital.
Harris, at that point, tipped over into obsession. That obsession with Berlin cost the lives of a very great many. And I remember Sir Ralph Cochrane, who was commanding officer of 5 Group, one of Harris's most devoted supporters. And I remember so well him saying, Berlin was too tough for us. Berlin won.
The battle for Berlin had shown beyond doubt that the war couldn't be won by bombing alone. With the D-Day landings just weeks away, Bomber Command would now be drawn into a wider role in support of the Allied advance over land, sea and air. 185,000 Allied troops poured off the boats and landed on the heavily defended beaches of Normandy. With a foothold in Europe now secured, the bomber crews could be forgiven for thinking that maybe now there would be a respite.
As soon as D-Day came, I thought my job was finished. I'd let the rest of the guys get on with it. They've landed in Europe. It's up to the army now. That was my feeling.
It is, however, ironic that just as it appeared to be certain that the Germans were going to be defeated on land, i.e. the time when, in retrospect, it looks as if one could have eased off the pressure from the air, that was the time at which this weapon became most powerful and most effective. It had just got very good at doing what it did, and what it did was to destroy cities.
Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command, remained more convinced than ever that bombing alone would defeat Germany.
The dream that everybody had had in early years of the war had now become reality, that Harris could deliver, if not the absolute knockout blow, he could certainly make Germany crumble.
Whilst the land forces ground forward mile by mile on both the eastern and western fronts, Germany's resistance showed no signs of weakening.
There is something of a view that after the Battle of Normandy, and the destruction of the German forces in France in August 1944, that was more or less it. It wasn't. Of the 700,000 or so casualties suffered by the British and American armies in Europe, 2/3 of them were incurred after the end of the Battle of Normandy.
The closer Germany came to defeat, the fiercer the fighting and the greater the casualties. No wonder that for Harris, the bombing war was far from over.
Were they seriously to say that these bombers should stay on their airfields and do nothing? There were the land forces advancing. In what way could they be helped? In what way could this war be shortened by even a week or a month?
So Bomber Command's offensive was cranked up yet another gear. In the last 3 months of 1944, more bombs were dropped on Germany than in the entire first 2.5 years of the war. But Arthur Harris's continued targeting of cities had still not provided the decisive blow. And not all the Allies agreed with Harris's insistence on targeting cities. The Americans thought that bombers were better used attacking key industries, in particular oil refineries.
The notion was that if these hydrogenation plants, which produced artificial oil from coal, could be knocked out, then basically you could bring the German war effort to a halt.
And they also believed that their scientific approach to singling out the vulnerable targets in the German economy was going to be far more effective than the British approach of bombing cities.
This difference, of course, was encapsulated in the American decision to bomb by day, so they could see these targets properly or more effectively, and the British decision that they would bomb by night.
Germany now suffered round-the-clock bombing, but the Americans were to discover just how imprecise precision bombing really was.
The problems the Americans found, of course, was that it was one thing to say you can hit these precise targets, quite a different thing to do it. It was so cloudy much of the time, and so they developed systems of blind bombing where you just attack where you thought the target was through cloud.
The reality was that for all the talk about precision, the American raids themselves were rarely very precise. It has been said with some truth that the main difference was that the RAF precision-bombed area targets and the US Air Force area-bombed precision targets.
So for the wretched Germans underneath, there was no meaningful distinction between what the Americans were doing and what the British were doing.
The bombing continued to intensify. For Arthur Harris, there was no doubt that Germany must be stopped, whatever the cost.
Harris was now an obsessive, in that any man who personally collects in his home photographs of wrecked German cities, his famous blue books or notorious blue books, and shows them to any visitor, to the point that members of the royal family who came by would be frequently embarrassed. They'd be seized by Harris, like the Ancient Mariner, and dragged off to come and look at his blue books. He became fixated with these images of the destroyed cities of Germany.
We keep on stabbing and stabbing, and which keeps on coming back, coming back, coming back. The sheer resilience and fighting power of the German army was quite staggering to everybody at the time.
So the eyes of Bomber Command turned to new targets, deep in eastern Germany. This decision would spark one of the most destructive and controversial raids of the war. By 1945, Bomber Command had become the most potent destructive force in the war. Its crews knew this, but were shielded from the worst of the horrors unleashed below.
You realised with satisfaction that you were helping to win the war that particular time, destroying their industries and their railways and so forth. The personal thought of killing people didn't enter your head an awful lot.
We had an idea that what we were doing to the German cities was what they had done to us. Our main feeling was one of self-preservation. Let's hope to heaven we get through this and get back.
It was an impersonal war. I was only too glad I wasn't in the army and had to put a bayonet through another man's stomach or something like that.
When I was in that aircraft, I was a young man. Those sparkling lights on the black velvet background, they weren't people to me. There were no people. They were just a target. Its distance and blindness which enable you to do these things. If we could have seen the women and the children burning to death in agony, I don't think we could have done it.
But as Allied troops advanced, they still faced bitter German resistance. So for Air Marshal Arthur Harris, it was now the time to hit more targets, not fewer, and hit them harder than ever before.
They were therefore looking for targets which they could destroy, ones which had not really been attacked before, and they found 3 in particular in East Germany, at the behest largely of Churchill, and they came up with Leipzig, Chemnitz and Dresden.
At dusk, on the 13th of February 1945, hundreds of heavily laden bombers set off for Germany, just as they had done on so many nights before. Their target was Germany's 7th largest city, Dresden. Their objective, to stop German reinforcements from reaching the Russian front by smashing Dresden's transport infrastructure.
Dresden was another raid just like any other. To the people who were doing it, who've been doing things like this every night for the last 4 years, it didn't seem that special. It was just another city in the last months of a very long war.
Dresden, as far as we were concerned on the day, it was just another operation. At the briefing, they said this is a very important rail and road and waterway junction, and this town needs to be obliterated.
The target seemed no different from any other, except for one thing. Dresden had so far escaped all serious damage from bombing. It didn't look like a wartime industrial target. The so-called Florence of the North was a renowned cultural gem, packed with treasures and priceless artworks. But the stunning architecture concealed state-of-the-art factories that produced radar and signal devices and communication equipment, Dresden's specialities.
Most people didn't know there were these factories in Dresden. They're not immediately evident when you go to a place like that, when what you see is the palaces and the churches on the river and the beautiful river meadows and the surrounding countryside and so on.
Worst of all for Dresden was a terrible combination of factors that would make this raid one of the most destructive of the war.
Dresden was in a sense the raid that went horribly right. It was the perfect raid. There were almost no cock-ups, which was practically unheard of. The weather was perfect, which in February is unheard of. And in fact, it was a patch of fine weather just over Dresden. 30, 40 miles to the north. You couldn't see anything.
Much of the flak defending the city had been moved to the Russian front. The air raid shelters were makeshift and inadequate. At 10 p.m, the first of the Pathfinders swooped down and dropped their blazing coloured flares. Experienced and highly trained, their job was to mark exactly where to bomb. They carried out their task with deadly accuracy. Then came the first wave of big heavies, Lancasters, loaded with bombs and incendiaries. After a deliberate pause to let the fires take hold of the city, came the second wave.
On the run into the target, it's very rare that we had any remarks from the front other than the bomb aimer giving instructions and so on. But on this occasion, I do remember somebody saying, "Look at those fires. What a target." Now, we must have been about 20,000 feet. And the Lancasters around us, all going in on the same heading, were quite clearly lit up, with a red glow from the fires 20,000 feet below.
The second blow arrived about 1 in the morning, when people were still staying in their cellars as they were told to by the air raid authorities. They said, the air raid shelter is the safest place to be.
The second wave was double the size of the first. 555 bombers poured their bomb load down onto the burning target. The fires that raged through the city were rapidly sucked in by a vacuum to form one giant firestorm.
When the firestorm came, People died in their thousands, not from being blown apart or burned, but through suffocation, through asphyxiation. And the firestorm sucked all the air out. There was no escape. You couldn't get through the burning streets, so people stayed in their cellars. And that's how they died, of simple lack of air. When the cellars were broken into after they'd cooled down after the raid, in many cases, row upon row were found sitting there slightly pink-faced through the carbon monoxide, but otherwise sitting in neat rows on benches, waiting for the raid to end, which of course it never did for them.
The following day, the Americans came to finish off what the British had started. Their B-17s dropped a final barrage of bombs on an already devastated, smoking city. In less than 24 hours, between 25,000 and 40,000 people died. As many as half of them through asphyxiation. 14 miles of city lay in rubble. The scale of the damage and loss of life inflicted at Dresden ensured it would become infamous. The technology of aerial bombardment had reached its inevitable and brutal conclusion.
The distance travelled by Bomber Command, technically and in terms of capability, but also morally, was huge.
It's very hard to get one's mind around the transformation of the bomber war from those early primitive days when these very early primitive aircraft were setting out to grope, as they used to say themselves, over Germany, to just look for something to drop a few bombs on.
To the selection of Dresden as target for tonight, and the complete destruction of a city as a matter of routine.
The sophistication and the scale of those massive efforts in the last days of the war is quite extraordinary by comparison with what preceded it.
And it didn't stop with Dresden. In the following month, more bombs were dropped than in any previous month of the war. And other German cities suffered casualties that were proportionately even higher. But it was Dresden that would come to haunt the public imagination.
Dresden has just become the symbol, really, of something which was happening to a lot of German cities at that late stage of the war.
With the collapse of Germany imminent, unease started to grow about bombing in general, and Dresden in particular. Even Churchill, who had sanctioned carpet bombing from the start, began to distance himself from Bomber Command and its unapologetic leader, Arthur Harris. But it was not the politicians who would bear the burden of the guilt of bombing. It was the airmen, the young men who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs of the war, who had obeyed orders and had witnessed almost 56,000 of their comrades die in the process. It was they who were forced to swallow one final bitter pill. All of Britain's fighting men received a campaign medal, except for the men of Bomber Command.